Well, hey everybody, it's Romania Black, and welcome to episode 11 of the Apothecary Diaries. Oh, I'm so excited. I've got a lot I want to talk about with the book that I'm almost, just like with this season, I'm almost halfway through the book, which is exciting. I'm getting there slowly but surely, and then I have a couple comments I want to talk about before we start episode 11. But yeah, I was like, I can't wait. Last episode, we had the whole deal with the honey and the apiary that Feng Ming, who is, or Feng Ming, who is the head lady in waiting for Lady Aduo, that her family does, could possibly be connected to some poisoning, could be connected to these wooden tablets. We'll just have to wait and see. I'm super excited to see how it all comes together. It was so frustrating because MaoMao seemed to have cracked the code last episode, but she didn't tell us how she cracked the code, and I was like, oh girl, come on now, you gotta give us something. So we're just gonna have to see how that goes. But yeah, my dogs are gonna be super needy, and that's okay. So I want to talk about the comments before we dive into the last eunuch of China. Anime Annie pointed out that the show, in regards to young brides throughout history, this is back with Lady Li Shu and everything, the show does not pretend that the things that happened within it didn't occur, but I really love the way Anime Annie put this. It doesn't paint it in a light that is acceptable by the viewers. And that is such a thing. And I honestly, I'm going to do a video just to tell you all, a video essay. It's going to take me forever to do, but once I'm caught up with Berserk, I'm going to want to do a video essay. But part of my big complaint with that series is that it doesn't necessarily paint the certain trauma that it tells the audience as acceptable necessarily, but there is a large part of the fandom in that series. It's like, well, that's just how it was historically accurate and blah, blah, blah. I hate that excuse. I hate when people are like, it's historically accurate. I'm like, yes, it may have happened in history, but this is modern fiction. How you portray it is very important, and you have the opportunity as a modern author to take a historically accurate event and present it to an audience in a way that is both mature but also points out the horrific nature of it. And I think that Apothecary Diaries does this very well. It does not just say, oh yeah, this is just how things were and we just deal with it. It's like, no, this is how horrible it was. Let's not repeat. And I think that Jinshi, when he feels, or sees a few episodes ago, MaoMao talking about, what life is like being in her position, it really deeply affects him, and he makes a change because of it. And I think that that's really, really valuable. So anyway, Anime Annie, you're preaching to the choir, let me tell you. But also, Algumalgium points out that the seamstresses, the one seamstress for the emperor that comes, all the others asked for MaoMao to sew in a stone pocket into their silk kimonos and their outfits so that they could stay warm. But the seamstress from the emperor did not. Instead, they asked how to make it. So it was a really, really cool example of showing how someone that works for the emperor that has those sewing skills wanted to learn the technique so they could go back and do it themselves. So they wouldn't have to rely on MaoMao. They could do it themselves, and it would make them a more valuable servant to the emperor. And so I thought that was really cool to point out. And then finally, I love the way that Kaylin V talked back in episode 5 or 6 about how Jinshi and MaoMao, they both literally wear masks, both literally and figuratively. Like with MaoMao, it's a literal mask where she's putting on the freckles, putting on the dirty makeup, making herself look worse intentionally. With Jinshi, it's more of a metaphorical mask where he's like playing the pretty playboy and like the flirt and everything with the smolder. But then you get these moments, especially around MaoMao, where he is more serious and he kind of drops that wall down and presents more of how he truly is. And MaoMao's starting to see little glimpses of that, but I'm like, girl, you need to see the whole thing. You need that wall to come down for her to get like the full effect. And so maybe it'll happen this season. I feel like it will to an extent, but it's just a matter of time. When is it going to occur? So I do want to talk about the book, so this may be a longer intro, but y'all are used to that. So I'm about halfway through the book, and Sun Yao Ting's adventures continue, and this particular section that I read talked a lot about the emperor, which I thought was interesting. So the emperor at the time was Pu Yi, who was a very young emperor, and Sun Yao-ting talks about the emperor getting married, and I thought this was really interesting because, again, this is taking place around 1922, which is just 100 years ago. 100 years ago, y'all. 1922, not that long ago. But it talked about the wedding of Emperor Puyi, and during the nuptials, he was actually marrying two wives, which I thought was interesting. Wanrong was his empress, and Wenju was his consort. So on the wedding day, Wenju was ushered into the palace early in the morning and kind of like tucked away, and then that night, Wanrong would arrive at midnight for the wedding ceremony. So I thought that was interesting. The idea that the consort, like the concubine, was like taken in first, being like, "Oh, girl, go hide over here," and then Wanrong came later for the actual ceremony, like the empress crowning and all of that. I thought that was really, really interesting. And so Sun Yao-ting talks about the entire procession and how that all occurred. But then, because Sun Yao-ting is very innocent, he's a very naive individual, and he talks about learning about these various things and customs as he goes. But the wedding procession moved to the Hall of Union and Peace, where Puyi and Wanrong completed the ceremony by, quote-unquote, paying respects to the heaven and earth, or bowing. And then afterwards, Sun Yao-ting saw many people head north for the Palace of Earthly Peace. "Where are they going?" he asked an elder eunuch. "Well, of course you wouldn't know. The emperor and empress are going to their nuptial chamber." So everybody just like followed them, which if you've watched any like historical, it's done a lot in medieval. I think of Game of Thrones, they follow them to the bed chambers and all that. And all of these women are singing this wedding song to them as they go. What's interesting is that after a while, a resplendently dressed woman arrived and entered the room. "Look, here comes the treasure finder," the eunuch said. "What's a treasure finder?" Sun Yao-ting asked. "Well, who's this ignorant brat with such a silly question?" An old eunuch acquainted with Sun Yao-ting explained to him in a low voice, "That lady's job is to look for the happy sign after the emperor and empress have spent their wedding night together." "Well, what's the happy sign?" young Sun Yao-ting said. He was about 16 when this is going on. He's like, "I'll explain it to you later." So then the eunuchs waited a long time outside the nuptial chamber without catching a glimpse of the emperor. The next morning, word got around that Puyi did not spend the night with the bride empress. Some eunuchs said he did not even like her in the first place. According to another rumor, the emperor had little interest in women. So Sun Yao-ting learned from another eunuch that the happy sign, referring to the empress's virgin blood on her wedding night. For many eunuchs, the absence of the happy sign following an emperor's wedding was a good joke. But several senior eunuchs looked very worried, regarding it as a bad omen. And so I thought that was interesting that the emperor was like, has nothing to do with this woman, which we'll talk about Wanrong in a minute. She's interesting as the empress. It just seems like an arranged marriage. So in 1923, Sun Yao-ting points out that they were showing a film for the eunuchs and other guests. Like they had a little silent film, they had a projector and everything set up, whatever the technology of 1923 was, to like watch a movie. And the rumor is, what people suspect was that they kept all the electrical cords running the movie, they kept them plugged in too long and the wires overheated and it caused a fire. But the point was there was a fire that broke out within the palace, and it burned a total of 132 rooms. Not all of the rooms, mind you, not all of them, but 132 rooms burnt in this fire. And Sun Yao-ting kind of laments that all these treasures were lost forever. But after this fire, the Emperor Puyi, he thinks that all of the eunuchs are trying to kill him. Like he starts coming out being like, all these eunuchs are trying to kill him and having this paranoia, which comes out of nowhere. Sun Yao-ting's like, the emperor never was paranoid around the eunuchs before, but suddenly because of this fire, he is. So Sun Yao-ting kind of notes that he didn't know if there's anything else going on behind the scenes that he wasn't privy to. We, the audience, don't know if there's anything else leading Puyi to believe this about the eunuchs, but he was very convinced they were trying to kill them. And he's like, I'll get rid of them all. And so all the eunuchs are really worried because they're like, are we going to die? Are we going to be put to death? Because we didn't start this fire, but he thinks that we all did. And so as it turns out, we find out exactly how many eunuchs are in the palace at the time. By Puyi's orders, 170 were allowed to stay. to attend all of the guests. Like, Puyi didn't trust any of the eunuchs at this point, and he wanted them all gone. But the other house servants were like, but then who's going to brush our hair? And they were like, no, let the eunuchs stay and the servants stay to help clean up the place, because heaven knows we don't want to do that. So they let 170 stay, but the rest of the 900 plus eunuchs all had to leave the palace. They would receive 2 months of pay as compensation and 1 month's pay as imperial bounty. Those with no place to go could stay temporarily in the Goosewing Tower by the Gate of Divine Prowess, and they would have a bed to sleep in and porridge to eat, but they had to leave within a month. So Sun Yao Ting, he's like, well, shit, I don't have anywhere to go, but I can't do anything, so I guess I'll just pack up my stuff and leave. And Sun Yao Ting is a very innocent character, and I like his character and his voice in this story because he's like bleakly optimistic. He's like, well, I have no other choice, but I'm gonna be happy about it because at least I'm alive. And it's like, well, that's a good way to look at it. So he ends up finding his old mentor and stays with him, and it's really sweet. He like cries with him, and the mentor, like the eunuch, like pats his back, and he's like, it's gonna be all right, we're gonna be good. And as luck would have it, I love that all of these things with Sun Yao Ting's life are all like in happenstance. So as luck would have it, one of the servants or one of the concubines knew about Sun Yao Ting and how good he was at his job, and told the empress, and the empress requested him to come back and work for her because she's like, I heard you're good at your job and you don't complain and you don't cause a fuss, so come back here. So him and 2 other eunuchs go to work for her, to work for Wanrong, the empress. And so the last part of this is just Sun Yao Ting talking about working with her. And Wanrong, the empress, she is a character. Like, she's so fascinating. She's very young. She's only like 19 years old. She's super young. She's like full of vigor. She also has a very dual personality. Like, she's really sweet and giddy, and then at the drop of a hat, she instantly starts yelling at people and getting really temperamental. And so, you know, we've talked in the Apothecary Diaries about the makeup and the lead and if it caused like hysteria or mood swings. The book doesn't come out and say that because I don't think Sun Yao Ting could make that guess, but she has a lot of mood swings. She can be really happy and then super furious. And luckily for Sun Yao Ting, he makes her laugh. Like, he tells her jokes because he learned as part of his upbringing as a eunuch, you know, to use comedy to kind of like ease the tension. So he uses that to his advantage. But what I thought was interesting in all of this says, the Palace of Gathering Elegance, located in the western part of the Forbidden City, was known as one of 6 Western palaces. After Sun Yao Ting became a eunuch in attendance for the empress, he moved to the Western Hall of the Palace of Universal Happiness, west of the Palace of Gathering Elegance, and he shared a room with the head eunuch there. So there's like all these formalities, and there's like a picture they show of the emperor and the empress. The emperor's not much of a catch, but he seems very bitter in all of his photographs, like he really doesn't want to be there. And Wanrong, she just looks like, I am happy to be empress, let me have this. Like, she seems perfectly fine about it. But I like that there's a little story in here about how the empress, what's really kind of sad, and it kind of reminded me of Gyokyo, where she's like sitting by herself looking out the window and the emperor comes in to check on her. There's this moment where Wanrong is like eating her breakfast by herself, and the emperor never comes and eats with her. And they're married, and she's by herself. And so Sun Yao Ting kind of like, she requests him to come eat with her, and he starts to eat with her, and they like form this relationship, like a very platonic just relationship where she just wants somebody to talk to. And it's like, oh damn, like she's stuck in this 200-room palace by herself. The emperor doesn't care about her, and she just wants somebody to talk to. And it's really interesting. But yeah, they have all of these conversations, and they start to develop this relationship, and it just talks about all the different things. Now, one thing that was interesting, the last thing I'll talk about in this, is that whenever the empress was on her period, which, you know, every month, they called it a leave of absence. I guess she wasn't to be around the emperor during this time. I mean, obviously, you're really, after your period is when you're most likely to like ovulate and get pregnant. So during your period's not really an ideal time for any of that. So during her period, she would go on a leave of absence. And Sun Yao Ting's job was to go to the emperor and be like, So she's on a leave of absence, meaning she's not going to be around you for a week. And he'd be like, okay, cool. And then he'd leave. And then whenever her period is over, he'd go back to the emperor and say, leave of absence is over. And the emperor would be like, cool. So nothing happened. But the staff in the book are all amazed because Sun Yao Ting, he figured out like when her periods were about to happen because she would like stop eating or had these like just little indicators that most women have that are habitual, and he could detect. He's like, oh, it's time for me to go tell the emperor. And they'd be like, how does he know? And he's just like, we figure it out. The only other scandalous thing in here is that they talk at the very end of the part that I was reading, there was no bathhouse for eunuchs on the palace grounds. Lu, the head eunuch of the high court consort Jinshi, ran a eunuch-only bathhouse at the north end of Beishang Street. Every customer had a bed, a table, and a bathtub to themselves and was served a pot of tea before taking the bath. Eunuchs felt at home at the bathhouse because many of its employees, including the back rubbers and pedicurists, were also eunuchs. However, Sun Yao-ting found something sinister about the place. If a young eunuch acknowledged an old eunuch as his master at the bathhouse, they could end up having a sexual relationship. Sun Yao-ting, therefore, often went to a public bathhouse north on Shatan Street. It had a large bathing pool, but he usually paid extra to get a small bathtub to himself to avoid being ridiculed because of his mutilation. So then he talks about castration did not always deprive the eunuchs completely of sexual desires. Quite a few eunuchs had an obsession with anything related to sex and would go to extreme lengths to find substitute outlets. They enjoyed pornographic paintings, had endless gossip about sex, and many were in same-sex relationships. Sun Yao-ting, though, found himself attracted to pretty women. When shown first some pornographic paintings in Prince Saitao's house, he remained sleepless all night with excitement. So we established that there's not going to be any BL experiences for Sun Yao-ting. He is very much heterosexual, but a lot of eunuchs were not, and a lot of them were obsessed with sex. So there you go. They just had to find a different outlet for it, but that's where I'm at. And I'm sorry these intros take so long, but this book is fascinating. And the more I learn about Sun Yao-ting, it makes me kind of appreciate Gao Shun and Jinshi's struggles, because I'm like, this wasn't easy. They also talked in there real quick about how a lot of eunuchs, they just had trouble. The reason why the bathhouse was such a big deal was because a lot of eunuchs, because of their castration, they couldn't control their bowel movements. So if they had to pee, they just, wet themselves frequently. And so the problem with wetting yourself frequently is that you always smell like piss. And so he kind of says that in the book. He's like, you always smell like urine, so you have to change your clothes and bathe every day. It's like ritual. Otherwise, not only will you smell, but it's not hygienic. So it's so interesting to see this little sect of culture and how this little world inside this palace was run. It's so fascinating. But yeah. Anyway, I've talked for nearly 20 minutes, so I'm super excited for this episode of Apothecary Diaries. Hopefully my dogs will stop being stupid and let me enjoy this. So anyway, but we're not going to waste any more time. We are going to start the Apothecary Diaries, episode 11, and we're going to do that here in 3, 2, 1, and let's go. I don't think my brain had time to catch up with all the exposition that this episode was throwing down. Oh my God! I had to go back before starting this discussion and be like, wait a minute, hold on, last 5 minutes, wait a second, we gotta go back, look at this, we're gonna go through this episode. But I'm like, so, okay. I still have questions. But this show, I'm sure, is going to answer said questions, but we got to go through this, because I was like, oh, buddy, Jinshi is a lot more important than he seemed to be 5 seconds ago, right? And now, what about MaoMao? We still don't know about them damn tablets. We're going to go, I guess Feng Mian is tied up with the tablets, but they didn't really, the thing about it is they never really fully explained the tablets and the code. They kind of did last episode by saying that it was a way of communication, but I'm like, I guess it was her way of communicating with the servant and stuff that ends up committing suicide. But so we're going to go through this. I do like that we get to see the aconite, the flower that you get the nectar from that creates the honey that's poisonous. I'm glad that we went through that. It looks a little bit like a tiger lily, which all lilies have some degree of poison in them after all. I like that Lady Gyokyo, her box that she delivers her like mafia style messages in, is black with her little flower on it. I was like, damn girl, just get all up in there, intimidating and shit. Speaking of intimidating, this whole scene with Feng Ming and MaoMao, and you just chop down the knife. I was like, oh, I did think for a hot second that she might get hostile and try to stab MaoMao. So I'm glad MaoMao had like her bulletproof vest of all her layers, being like, I really don't want to get stabbed today. Poison's one thing. Her body can build up immunity to poison. You can't build up immunity to stab wounds. It's just a little bit harder, right? But so we just went through everything. Just this whole episode was exposition. This is based off of a light novel that's been adapted into a manga. So that should be noted first and foremost, because this definitely felt like the chapter. If you've ever read Sherlock Holmes before, or you've ever read any mysteries, there's always like right when you get to the climax and you solve the mystery, it usually happens one of two ways. Usually you have either the lead up to the climax is when the characters figure out what's been going on, who's been at fault, and the climax is catching the person at fault and making them come out and say that they did it, which is what this episode is. Usually a mystery novel will have those chapter or chapters leading up to that moment. The other option is that you build up to the climax happens and you catch the culprit, and then the aftermath is where you explain it all, and you're like, well, here's how they did it. Here's how Old Man Jenkins did it. So this was the former, where I could see in hindsight this being chapters in a novel leading up to the reveal of what all went down, and then the aftermath is with Jinshi and Aduo like saying, okay, here you go. That's it, right? That seems like the case. So this definitely felt like chapters of a novel, but they managed to make it very interesting in animated form, which I'm really grateful for. But I like that Feng Ming had all this stuff packed, like they're getting ready to go, and she thought, I would have gotten away with it too if it wasn't for that girl who was somehow related to the doctor back then and also likes poison. But she was ready to just leave with Aduo. And here's the thing, they weren't getting kicked out of the palace as a whole. They were just leaving the rear palace and going to a south palace. They were going to another location. So they weren't getting kicked out on the streets or getting sold off to another person. I think that that's important to note, because I had been afraid going into this that she was getting sold off to someone else, even though she was 35. When they said 35 and then she couldn't have kids, I'm like, well, sometimes women hit menopause early, and then once you hit menopause, you can't have kids anymore. But usually you're in your at least 40s, but primarily your 50s when that happens, or late 40s anyway. So at first I was like, well, how did she? But if her uterus had a bunch of damage, yeah, that'll do it. Especially if it comes out, that'll do it. And then you're kind of screwed. No more kids for you. I'll turn the sound off here. But yeah, so when they said she was packing up, I had assumed before going into this episode that she was going to get sold off to somebody else and be their concubine, and it was going to be like a political trade. I'll trade you your young lady and give you this, which seemed kind of weird anyway, because with last episode they established the emperor and her were friends growing up. They were childhood friends and had this kid. And so I was like, okay, all right. But the thing in the end of it is that no, she's just going somewhere else. She's just moving to a new location, and Feng Ming was going to go with her, but that doesn't end up happening. I appreciate that they don't show her execution. They give her character a little bit of dignity in this episode, because it really wasn't her fault. It was, but what the nice subversion in this is that she didn't know what she was doing was harmful. She thought she was helping, and then you gave the newborn honey, it poisoned him, and then she finds out later on through Li Shu that that's what was the problem, and she's like, shit, I killed the baby. And the worst part is, she didn't kill Aduo's baby, I mean, not the worst part. The baby died either way. It's bad either way. But the crazy part is she didn't kill Aduo's baby. She killed the Empress, Dowager Empress's baby. And it's like, oh shit. So we'll get into this, but essentially, Aduo and the Emperor, when he was a prince, not the Emperor yet, when he was in prince mode, they got together and they had Jinshi. So Jinshi is the Emperor's son. And he just looks like Aduo. But here's the thing. Now, of course, this is all just conjecture. This is all just suspicion, right? There's no proof. So MaoMao's like, I'm just making an assumption. He looks just like her. Not hard to guess. But so the theory is then you had the Empress. And the Empress, the Dowager Empress, we'll put her up here. Her and the old Emperor, they had this son who has died. And then the Emperor also had him. So the actual brother of the Emperor was swapped with Jinshi at birth. They were both swapped. And this was 17 years ago, so Jinshi's only 17. So that adds some context, right? Which makes sense. She's 35. She was 18 when she had him. Fair enough. That all makes sense. So we all got that at the time. And he was 19, so makes sense. He's 36. Okay, so Jinshi, and he was 17, was swapped, and the actual brother of the Emperor is dead. Because Fang Ming killed him with the poison. All right. The crazy part is how they got swapped. Like, how did they get swapped at birth? I'm gonna go back to that part in the episode, but I'm like, how they got swapped at birth. It's like, who didn't notice that? They were in different palaces, weren't they? In different rooms. So who orchestrated that? Did Fang Ming orchestrate that? I guess. How did that work? So that's the one thing we don't know. And MaoMao doesn't really seem to have an answer to that question. She's just like, I guess they could have got swapped at birth, theoretically. And that could have been the case. But she doesn't have any proof. So, I mean, this could all be wrong. Jinshi could be related to her in another capacity, but we're going to go with it for right now and say that he's the Emperor's son, because that's what the story is. That's what her conjecture is giving off. So the big question then is he a eunuch or not? If he's the Emperor's son, why would you castrate the Emperor's son? Because shouldn't he be next in line for the throne? She was a concubine. But there's a lot of things that kind of go into that. One, okay, she was the childhood friend. Now, MaoMao drops a little piece of information about her that is the first time we hear it, that I was like, wait, what? So she's a nurse's daughter, which means she's a commoner. She's a nurse's daughter, so if the nurse worked for the Empress, she probably grew up around the Emperor when he was a prince, so that's how they're childhood friends, that's how they know each other. So there's that, right? We'll talk more about it, but I'm assuming that Jinshi is a eunuch, but we don't know if he is or not. What if he's not? And he's just... They talked about them finding out, someone finding out that he was switched at birth, which, I mean, if you were the Dowager Empress and you looked at this kid who was born the same time as Aduo's son, and your kid looked exactly like Aduo, I think it wouldn't take me long to put two and two together and go, he was born the same time as her son that died. He looks exactly like her. I wonder if this is actually my son or not. I don't know, because he doesn't look like the Emperor at all. At all. Like, looks just like her. So, Anyway, we'll get back to that. But this whole scene with MaoMao and Fang Ming, just like the tension is crazy in this scene. And the looks that head lady in waiting gives her is just stone-faced. So MaoMao asks what happened when she gave birth. And I like that at first she's like, well, that's none of your business. And she's like, well, it kind of is, because it involves my dad and involves a lot of things and involves everything going on. She's like, my doctor is the doctor who attended that birth was my father. And she's like, oh shit. So, Now, my guess is the misfortune was that Lady Otto was a princess concubine at the time and gave birth the same time as the Empress Dowager. And I like the face that the head lady in waiting makes, like, you know an awful lot, girl. And so then poor Aduo, like, there was no medicine back then, no epidurals. You just had to go through that. Like, oof. Although, one of the coaches that I work with at work, she's had 4 kids. So bless her. But 2 of her kids she had without epidurals and 2 she had with. And the first one she had with an epidural, and the middle 2 children she did not. And then the 4th one she said she had to because there was a complication. They're like, you're going to need the drugs for this. And she was like, okay. But I asked her, I was like, why did you not get the epidural the other 2 times after the first time? Because you would think it'd be the other way around. And she said that the recovery time, if you have the epidural, is a lot longer. And she's like, your body naturally heals a lot faster through a natural birth. She's like, basically for 10 minutes, you feel like you're dying. And then after that, you're fine. It's like, oh, cool. She's like, you feel like you're at death's door for 10 minutes and then everything's cool. And I'm like, awesome. But I can't imagine, that you have no choice. You've got to go through this process of giving birth and everybody's just hanging out there. And they don't really show her dad in that moment. They're like, well, when is the doctor coming? And they're like, he's still with the Dowager Empress. And he's like, it's all right. Feng Ming is by your side. The Empress Dowager was given high priority, and concubine Aduo's childbirth had to wait. And then, yeah, I like that they show just how miserable she is. Her and Jinshi looking just the same. Now, when she sees the baby, that's when she looks at the baby and like, it must have been when she lost her uterus. So this was the only kid she could have. And because her and the emperor were such good friends and he loved her, or they were at least good friends enough that he didn't want to, he kept her around because he's like, well, we're good friends, how we do. But he didn't want to let her go. But it seems like there might be pressure from the others around him to get another wife, to try to have another kid. So the solution is, well, I'm just going to send you to the South Palace, let you take residence there, but I can't keep you here. So we'll talk about that whole thing with Jinshi later, but MaoMao's just speculating. She's like, the child that was born passed away soon afterwards. But then and she says, and that's when the handmaiden says, well, you figured it all out despite being the daughter of the quack who couldn't help her. And MaoMao, I like that MaoMao kind of clenches her fist, like, oh, really? You're blaming my dad? He was forced to go to be at the birth of the Empress's son. He really didn't have a say in it, but you're going to blame him? Sure, okay. And that's like, she's like, I thought the cause of the baby's death was the toxic makeup, but she's like, my dad would not have had that powder being used. She's like, you're a wise person. You wouldn't have let the baby die from that. But the real cause was the honey. These flowers have poison in them, like aconite or azalea. But back then you weren't aware. You didn't realize that regular honey with no poison in it, the medicine you thought was good for health, is harmful to a newborn baby. And it can kill them. Yeah. Which is so sad, right? So the baby that was the emperor's brother passes away. And the thing about it is, she's like, my father, Loman, who was attending doctor at the time, was expelled, was blamed for the repeated mistakes, including the one at childbirth. And for switching the babies and for the babies being switched and not realizing it. I'm still amazed they let him live. I'm amazed they let him live. But that's a story for another day, maybe. Why they let him live and they killed her, we don't know. But maybe there's a story behind that we don't fully know of. Anyway, but then later on, you accidentally learned of the baby's death and how you can't give honey to infants. And you didn't want Aduo finding out that you killed her only child. And so then we have Li Shu. So I like this idea, too, that with Li Shu, who was with the old emperor, that she kind of has this like mother-daughter relationship with Aduo, and now she's with the other emperor. But I kind of like how this is framed, because it would be like, I can see now why the emperor really wants nothing to do with Li Shu, not only because she's so young, but because of that, like the relationship that she has with Aduo, where they're like mother-daughter. It's really just kind of weird. And to me, I feel like the Dowager Empress, based on this book, that shows that the Dowager Empress has a lot of power, and she has a lot of influence as well, especially if she's the mother of the emperor, or the wife of the emperor's parent, or their father, basically. Because that's been happening in this book. These empresses, they got a lot of power and a lot of influence, and kind of whatever they say, the emperor kind of just like, well, sure, all right. So we've only seen her like one time. I wonder how much influence she has and what her personality is like, because the ones in this book are something else. But, and not necessarily in a bad way, but they got a lot of diva in them. And I'm like, okay, I want to know more. So Li Shu and Aduo, I like the relationship they're shown to develop. Li Shu being taken away from her parents at a young age and not having a maternal figure in her life. Aduo's son leaving her at an early age, and the other one dying, and her not having a child. And her not getting to experience the actual process of being a parent. She didn't get to experience that because the Empress was raising her child. So of course she'd be horribly sad. And when she cried at the one child dying, I'm sure she was anguished, because whether that was her biological child or not, it was still her child to raise, as if it were her child. And so losing him, I mean, we saw that with Lihua. We've seen that with her. But yeah, I like the idea that you have Aduo like watching after Li Shu. Also, it kind of gives this little like nod of Li Shu and Jinshi now being kind of like siblings. Where she's like, oh, big brother Jinshi, because it's kind of like a foster sister, foster brother relationship where she treats Jinshi like her big brother, right? And if you've watched Revolutionary Girl Utina, maybe she kind of has like a nanami relationship with Toga. Who knows? So, you know, I feel like she might refer to Jinshi that way, you know? But she learned from Li Shu that you can't give honey to a child, and that's when she freaks out. Because Li Shu tells her, she's like, hey, my doctors told me I couldn't have honey. It makes me sick. And as a baby, it nearly killed me. And that's when she realizes what all happened. And so interestingly enough, now we know from the last episode why Li Shu was sneaking around trying to see Aduo, because she's tried to see her in the past, but Feng Ming won't let her near. And it's like, okay. And then later when the emperor passed away, she had to leave the rear palace unaware of why she was chased out. But then she came back as the new consort, as another high-ranking concubine, and a threat to Aduo's status. And she was just trying to be with Aduo, who was like her mother, and so that's why she poisoned the soup. I mean, at that point, Feng Ming was probably going to die, because if you deliberately were trying to poison one of the concubines, then yeah. She's like, and I would have gotten away with it too if it wasn't for you meddling apothecaries. But when it goes to the knife, I was like, are we about to have a knife fight up in this? But no. Instead, she just kind of breaks down. She's like, you know, this is just meaningless. I like that nobody touched the food with the honey or the tea. And she says, do you know what's most precious to the person most precious to you? And MaoMao's like, is this a trick question? She's like, no. She's like, the moment I met Lady Aduo, I knew I would never serve anyone else again. And what a true statement. Despite being a woman, she had a strong will and the ability to speak on even grounds with the prince. So the thing about it is, the prince seems to, more than anything, respect Aduo. Now, they were childhood friends. He respects her. She feels very much like she has a very masculine presence. It's almost like, you know, she didn't want to be a man. It's like, you know, born a woman in this world. What can you do? But I feel like she loved the emperor But we'll talk about this whole aspect of duty, duty hindering their friendship. It's like we couldn't just be two platonic friends because nope, since I was a lady, had to be more than that. But so we'll talk about that with Jinshi and everything here in a little bit. But she's like, I was just a lady in waiting who was following my parents' orders, and she was astonishing. But I took what was most precious to her with my own hands, and I took him away. And that shot where she's like with all the lady in waiting, and she just looks so like just absolutely devastated. And she's like, up until the age of 7, the slightest illness can easily kill them. My baby simply followed the will of the heavens. I'm very curious because the whole thing about turning the age of 7, that's kind of like such an ironic statement, because while any illness could easily kill a kid before the age of 7, in the book, if you're going to castrate a kid, you probably need to do it before the age of 7 so that they'll heal. And it's like, the irony of that statement is interesting. And so then she's like, Fang Ming talks about how she cried every night to going to sleep. And MaoMao says, what was her mental state like as she served Lady Aduo for the past 16 years? She didn't have her own partner. She was by herself, sacrificing everything for her. And then MaoMao's like, I can't relate. I don't have it in my heart to keep someone so close. That line is really important, and I feel bad for Jinshi, because I think Jinshi would like to be very close to MaoMao. But MaoMao's whole thing is that she is afraid, whether she wants to admit it or not, she's afraid to keep someone close because they could be easily lost. MaoMao pretty much acknowledges the state of this world that they live in this story. She's like, I could be sold off. I could be killed. I could be held as a traitor and murdered. I could be ran off. She's like, my partner could be implicated in whatever I do. She's like, I don't have it in me to put someone at risk because of my position and how little power I have. And I want to be like, MaoMao, I think you have a lot more power than you give yourself credit for. But she doesn't believe that. She believes that her life is so fragile and worthless that why would you fall in love? Because as soon as you do so, the chances are you're going to put yourself in danger and die and leave that person heartbroken. So it's almost like she's like, I don't want to leave somebody alone if something happens to me. And I'm like, girl, okay, sure. Don't tell Jinshi that. And then if he hears my story, Master Jinshi will surely apprehend Fang Ming, which is, there's no way she can escape capital punishment, and she knows that. And so MaoMao gives her a suggestion. She's like, the reducing 2 to 1 works on multiple levels in this episode. It not only refers to her taking 2 motives and making it 1, but it also refers to there being 2 heirs to the throne other than the emperor. Now there's only 1. So we had the brother, and now we have Jinshi. We'll talk about that whole eunuch thing here in a second, though. I'm waiting for us to get to that part in the episode so I can reference it. But she basically is like, look, you're probably going to die either way because you poisoned Li Shu and subsequently nearly poisoned Gokyo, which is a problem. So you're probably going to die from that. But why don't you go with that motive and let's not reveal that you killed the baby too? And that way, Aduo will not, you can go to your grave knowing that Aduo wasn't mad at you. The thing about it is, I think Aduo knew. I think by the end of this, she knows. And she just let Fang Ming go because she realized, like, hey, you tried, I don't think she knew that Fang Ming killed her kid, but I think she knew that they were swapped out. I think she figured that out because she talked to Jinshi and went to go see him. I think she knew that was her son, but there's nothing she can do about it. So I don't think she knew that Fang Ming killed the Empress Dowager's son, but because we see her seeing her looking at MaoMao walking away, and she wanted to talk to her. So poor MaoMao, she wants to go get some sleep. She unwraps and shows the bandages, but she gets some sleep, and then we have the next day where Jinshi's like, Fang Ming turned herself in. And then he's like, did you have anything to do with this? And MaoMao's like, what are you talking about? He's like, well, you went to the library and Gaoxun got you a lot of stuff. And she's like, oh, well, I thought it would show me something, but no, it was useless. And he's like, ugh. Feng Ming's motives, as you said, was to try to make sure that concubine Aduo could stay in the position of one of the 4 concubines. She's like, oh, I see. But she's already been determined to leave the rear palace. She'll live in the detached palace to the south. And does this incident have anything to do with that? And they're like, no, the decision was made a while ago. So this had all been predetermined a long time ago that she was going to move. But I feel that the thing about it is that Feng Ming didn't want it to come out with Lady Li Shu about the baby. So she tried to poison her to shut her up so that Aduo wouldn't figure that out. It was the Emperor's call. I think that's interesting. So the Emperor made a determination a while ago, looking very Gendo-like with his pose like this, which also Jinshi does this pose a lot, which is curious to me. So I'm like, like father, like son a little bit. Jinshi got, luckily, none of the Emperor's looks, all of Aduo's looks. Like, good. Good. Jinshi looks very handsome. The Emperor, not so much. But interesting. I find it interesting too, because that means now that Gyokyo's daughter is technically Jinshi's sister, and Li Hua's son was technically Jinshi's brother, which is like family tree of imperial family trees are crazy. I'm very curious why the Emperor sent her away. Why? I mean, obviously, I feel he let her go to the South Palace to keep her, out of everybody's hair, and so she doesn't have to mess with any of this stuff. We'll talk about that in a hot second. But I'm curious why switching out to a new concubine. What the reasoning was. I also like how Jinshi, she's like, oh, this flower's out of season. One of my friends is a agronomist, so she's very into horticulture, and she tells me all the time that if things like mums are out of season, she's like, why are they selling mums in the fall? They're spring flowers. And I'm like, I don't know. And she's like, this flower's out of season. That's out of season. So she'd get along great with MaoMao. But I like how MaoMao puts it in her mouth, and then Jinshi, does the same thing. He's like, oh. So he imitates her, and then she's like, the nectar's poisonous. And he's like, she's like, it's not lethal. You're fine. Like, live on the edge, Jinshi. Come on. Love it. So she's like, my suggestion to Feng Ming back then, the poisoning of concubine Li Shu and the cause of death for the baby. If these two motives became one, she could hide the cause of the baby's death from Aduo. Even if her own death is inevitable, that was the best I could do as a girl with no power. MaoMao keeps talking about how she has no power, but I'm like, girl, I know you technically don't, but I feel like her influence is a lot stronger than she lets herself believe, right? But yeah, so basically, Lady Feng Ming, she was like, well, if you're going to die, at least die giving some respect so that Aduo doesn't have to suffer anymore. So then we have the night before everything leaves, and we see, and now it makes sense, because look, Lady Aduo, her entire palace was in that color of those purples and everything. Jinshi's whole little palace that he has is the exact same colors. I was like, where have I seen these colors before? It's Jinshi's. They're exactly the same. And she shows up to have a drink with him, and he cannot hold his liquor. He gets drunk very easily, but she's sitting there being like, want to get a drink, son of mine, before I leave to go live somewhere else? So MaoMao can't sleep. She goes up to she finds that little step stool where the one servant had crawled up and jumped to her death, and she climbs up there and basically determines and says that Feng Ming was executed, and the concubine Aduo is set to leave the rear palace tomorrow. And that's when Aduo shows up with the drink. I love how different she looks. She just, with her hair up in the ponytail and everything. Like, she left Jinshi's after drinking with them and went to go hang out with MaoMao. But then she showed back up to be like, we'll talk about that in a second. So she's like, you're the girl who came to help clean the other day. I feel like in this moment, this was like a meet the parents sort of thing, where MaoMao has unsuspectedly been in front of the Emperor, Jinshi's father. And Aduo is like the mom, so it's like, let me meet you, girl, to see if you're worthy of being with my son. So she sits down there to drink with her, like she's on the rooftop. And MaoMao tries to leave, and she's like, oh, no, you're not going to leave. Don't you want to drink with me? And MaoMao's like, I really like booze, so yes. She's like, thank you very much. Yes, of course. I love this. The future mother-in-law and her sitting having a drink. And she's like, I'm pretty masculine, aren't I? And MaoMao's like, well, I feel like you're giving that impression on purpose. Like this is something you're trying to project. And she laughs about it, and she's like, well, you're an honest one. And she's like, yeah, after my son left me, I became the emperor's friend, not his concubine. So she says, after my son left me. So after my son was taken away and raised as the emperor's brother, when it's really his son, he was no longer his concubine, but the emperor's friend. Or rather, she corrects herself right after that. And I love this correction. She says, or rather, I returned to being his friend. So it almost felt like the idea of them having a kid, it could have been a moment of passion that led to an oopsie situation where it seemed like they were friends, but, you know, things happen. And if they liked each other, sure. But it seemed like, because he wasn't the emperor yet, right? He was the prince at the time. He was not the emperor. The emperor was still around with the Empress Dowager. And so it seems like maybe they got together and it was like, oops, pregnant. The same time the emperor's pregnant with the Empress Dowager. And so out of duty, you know, she's like, well, I'll be your concubine. I'll have your kid. And then after not only Jinshi was taken away and then the other one died and she found out she couldn't have kids anymore, then that aspect of duty was off the table and they were able to just be friends again. And so she talks about that and she's like, I never thought I would become a concubine. She's like, I was a concubine in name only and given the role out of pity. So that's the interesting thing we don't know. She was mainly just in name a concubine, and it was a moment of pity. So I don't know if it was like, if it was a political move and her family like had ties, because she seems like, you know, she comes from a family, you know, her mom was a nurse, but it seems like they were just childhood friends, and the only way it could work is if she was a concubine, and that's the only way they could be together. But she's like, it was just a title that was not really fitting of her and who she actually is. I wanted to hand it off to someone else as soon as possible. So that's the interesting part, is that she wanted to hand it off, but she stuck around until MaoMao and all of this came out in the open. So I don't know why the timing is now, what the reason is, why the timing is, why she waited this long before she could leave, because she didn't want to stay here. Maybe it was till Jinshi was of age and she had to stay till he was at least 17. Why cling on to it for so long? And so the thing that gets me is that MaoMao's like, well, she would have said this to anybody she met up here. And I'm like, MaoMao, quit underestimating yourself. I'm watching another show right now, Bloomin' to You. And in that series, the main character, Yu, she's just like MaoMao in the sense that she's like, oh, well, I'm not special. Anybody would have these conversations with anybody. It's not just me. And I'm like, it is just you. Both MaoMao and Yu don't realize how special they are. And I feel like, you know, Aduo, this is her last night here, and she's like, well, I'm going to tell you because, you know, you might end up getting with my son one of these days, so you might want to know this backstory, you know, before I go. And so then that's when she's like, well, she talks about the servant girl actually committing suicide and talks about how cold it would have been. I like that they both agree that it was a terrible way to go. And then just like a baller, she just pours one out for the servant girl that died. She's like, what a stupid way to go. Maybe she was stupid, but then again, we're all stupid. I like that. I like that she establishes, she's like, we all do dumb things in our life, so who are we to judge others, right? So yeah. Now, we see like the droplets there. I think the droplets there. Okay, that I was wondering what that was, if it was Jinshi crying at the bottom of the thing. No, it's just the leftover. It's supposed to be the sake that's left over from dropping, but it also looks like tears, so it kind of has a double meaning there. I love it. You have like the waning moon. She's like, perhaps we are all stupid. So, and that's when MaoMao's like, I think I get it now. The servant indeed committed suicide. And she's like, concubine Aduo noticed that. And maybe Feng Ming helped set it up. To take suspicion away from concubine Aduo, the servant chose to sink down into the cold water. To keep her secret hidden, Feng Ming chose to step up to the gallows. Regardless of concubine Aduo's own wishes, there are those who sacrifice their lives for her. That could be why she ended up leaving, is why she's kind of said things. Maybe she realized that after the garden party, because a bit of time passed after the garden party, so maybe, we don't know for sure yet, but maybe Aduo, after the servant committed suicide and the whole garden party incident, she was like, oh, well, things are starting to get out of hand. Like now, she's like, people are trying to get poisoned. It's connected to me. My own servants and handmaidens are losing their lives. She's like, I think it's time. I think before things get crazy, I need to go. And maybe she talked to the emperor and he agreed and set this all up just so things wouldn't go down. But I liked the idea that you cannot control who will try to save you. You can't help if people are going to try to sacrifice their lives for you. And I feel like that's foreshadowing that maybe Jinshi down the road is going to try to sacrifice something to save her. And she's like, I'm not worth it. And he's like, but you are. And then she's not romantic at all. So it'll be funny to see how she handles that. And she's like, well, I should go now too. It's getting cold out. So as she's climbing down, she falls and lands on Jinshi. And she's like, why are you here? And Jinshi's drunk. He's like, well, why are you here? Like, basically, he went and drank with Aduo. He's a lightweight, got drunk, and then she peaced out. And she's like, well, I'll get up now. And then he makes her sit back down with her. And he's like, no. She's like, let go. And he says, no, it's cold. I don't want to. And she's like, you're going to catch a cold without a coat, so go back to your own room. And then that's when she's like, are you drunk? And he's like, I had to. I was sharing a drink with someone. She's like, sharing? He's like, the host invited me to drink and loaded me up full of booze and then just took off. And when she finally came back, which was Aduo waiting for him, as he's been sitting there drinking, and he's been sitting there getting drunk, and she's like, I'll be back. And then when she finally came back, she told me she was satisfied now and threw me out. She basically was like, okay, you sit here and drink your juice, Shelby. I'm going to go talk to your future girlfriend, see if she's legit. Okay, she's legit. Now bye. The sad thing is that we are led to be implicated in the idea that Jinshi knows that she's his mom. That part to me is what seems clear. That Jinshi knows. He knows his parentage. That part seems clear enough. And he's sad because his mother is leaving him. And he's grown up around her all these years. And the question is, question one, when did he find out? Did he find out? I think he did find out. When did that happen? The emperor knows, he knows, who knows? It's all conjecture on MaoMao's part, but who knows? So he clearly knows that she's his mom. And she's like, well, I didn't know anyone in this Rip House could treat this guy like that. Yeah, but there's the thing. I feel like Jinshi's drawn to MaoMao because she's like Aduo. She doesn't, and the thing that's so sweet about this moment is that he can like get cozy with her and like hug her and embrace her and keep her by him because he knows she's not going to try. The thing about it is it reveals his vulnerability so much in this scene because he's able to be vulnerable and have this moment of weakness, but he knows that MaoMao is not going to take advantage of him. That she's not going to try to make it sexual. She's not going to try to like manipulate him or take advantage of him or hurt him. He can be himself in this moment and have this breakdown, and she's the only one he can do that around. Now, if she'd realized that, that'd be great. But no. She's like, wow, this guy, Aduo's got a lot of power. How dare? It's like, she's like, well, she's like, I'm not a part of this. But I'm like, she's like, I don't want to put up with a clingy drunk. It's good to know that Jinshi's clingy when he's drunk. And so she's like, wait, come to think of it, he did catch me as I fell. So, and this is very Don Mai Shin Shing Show thinking right here, where she's like, well, he did catch me. So, I mean, I could leave him, but I'm gonna stay here because, I mean, I do kind of owe him. I was like, girl, that thinking, She's like, well, it'd be rude to make him let go of me without even thanking him. So she goes to thank him, and that's when he starts crying. And he doesn't say anything. He just cries on her shoulder and hugs her. And he says, just a little bit longer. Keep me warm just a little longer. And then she just sits there. She's like, okay. I like she doesn't judge him. She doesn't ask questions. She's like, something's going on. I don't exactly know what it is, but you're not hurting me. If you just need a hug in this moment to, sob it out, and you need somebody to be there for that, and Gao Shun ain't gonna be the one to do it, then okay. All right. I owe you this much, I guess. I love that. I love it. I love the idea that their relationship is so accepting of one another that they're both like, okay, this is how it's going down. It's fine. It's so sweet. And then she's also like, like, I guess I'll just sit here and let this happen. So then the next day is when she leaves and she gives up. I like that MaoMao's first thought is, well, neither of them seem hungover. They genetically handle their booze afterwards very well. But yeah, wow, they're so similar. And then everybody's like all in tears and blushy around him. In order to leave the rear palace, she returns the crown, signifying her as the pure concubine. It'll be bestowed on another girl who will join later. Yep, and the way she looks, it almost looks like she's been crying, the blush that's on her eyes. And her and Jinshi, they look so alike. Yep. And that's when MaoMao's like, she did resemble somebody. It's Master Jinshi. It's like, you might as well swap outfits with them and they'd look exactly the same. And that's when she's like, swap. So she said, after my son left me. So that's when she starts thinking. She's like, she said not died, but left me. So MaoMao's wondering, like, well, that could be interpreted as saying that he's alive. So concubine Aduo's child and the then Empress Dowager's child, what if the babies were swapped? What if we had like a Freaky Friday situation? It must have been clear to concubine Aduo through her experience in childbirth. And so then we see the dad getting drug away. He's like, what are you doing? I have to tend to concubine Aduo. And they drug him away. Like, the dowager took priority. After all, she was just a nurse's daughter, a childhood friend of the prince. But her son would live a better life as the Empress Dowager's son. Now, the question is, in her state of being in that moment, could she decide whether that was a right or wrong decision? And then we see like little tiny Jinshi who looks so cute, but if the decision resulted in her son surviving, then that could have been all that she would have wished for. But what if people found out the babies were swapped later? If that was after one of the babies had died, well, that would explain why her father was physically punished for not noticing. And so then, if that were the case, it would explain why the emperor's younger brother is in a delicate position, and why Aduo, who's supposed to be a realist, stayed in the rear palace for so long. So the question is he a eunuch or not? That's the question. Because supposedly the emperor's brother, which is Jinshi, which is actually his son, is supposed to be the emperor's brother. And they mentioned back at the garden party, they were like, the emperor's brother's supposed to be here, but he's sick a lot. Somebody said that, but then in the episode, I have to go back and rewatch the episode. Someone said that, but then Jinshi, it would explain why Jinshi's in all the different palace gear because he's supposed to be the brother. But you would think that they would mention more often that Jinshi was the emperor's brother, right? So then, would they castrate emperor's brothers? So I want to know emperor. So is that something that would happen? That's a good question. I really want to know. There is one that talks about, there's one called Zhao Gao. It says, during the Zhao state, according to the records of grand historians, Zhao Gao's parents committed crimes and were punished. His brothers were castrated. It's unclear whether Zhao Gao himself was a eunuch or not. However, Qin Shi Huang valued Gao since he was learned in criminal law. So I don't know. It says Zhao was a minor official. Say, interesting. He was the imperial chancellor, a Chinese politician. So in that case, his brothers were castrated, but they don't know for sure if he was not. Interesting. I might have to do a little bit of research on that and see if those were the cases. So let me see. Were in China the emperor's brother? The only one that they mention on here is Zhao Gao, unless there's some other ones. Interesting. I don't know. Here's my thing. I think that it's a very big possibility that Jinshi was castrated, because I think there's a big possibility, because here's the thing. If they found out later on, if the Empress Dowager was like, oh, you're not my son, you're the son of Ado, this concubine who's a commoner, and my son, you're my grandson. Oh, then I could honestly see them castrating Jinshi, because one, he's not a bastard per se because he's the future emperor's son, but it is like a scandalous situation because it's not the Empress Dowager's son and not the actual emperor's son. So it's the younger brother technically. So I could see that. Also, I could see if they wanted the emperor's actual heir to the throne to be from a legitimate, marriage to an empress, then sure. And they wouldn't treat Jinshi as legit. I could see that. But I could also be like, why would the emperor be okay with castrating his own son? Why would he be all right with that? Because he was his brother, so why would he be castrated? So maybe Jinshi's not castrated. Maybe he's not a eunuch. Maybe, but why, if MaoMao knows that he's the emperor's brother and also technically his son, why would she think that he was castrated? I'm curious. I'm curious about that. I'm curious if we're going to get more on that. I feel like this series reveals little things very slowly in crumbs, so there's a good possibility that we'll get more on that later on. But yeah, she's like, and that would explain that again, why the concubine, why Aduo chose to leave now. I guess she's seen her sons in good hands. There's more to it than that. And of course, MaoMao's like, now it's an idiotic delusion of a story. It may not be true at all. So maybe Jinshi's not their kid. Maybe she's like Ado's cousin or her brother, or who knows. But it would make sense for Gao Xun to work for him because he was assigned to him as his eunuch since he was a kid. I don't know. I feel bad for poor Li Shu. And Li Shu like going after her and her looking like a mom in that moment to her. Oh, it's very sweet. But anyway, there are storm clouds gathering, which is not a good sign. And we see Gao Xun saying, here's a list of Fang Ming's family and those connected to them. Now, the thing is, that Jinshi's like, I heard she was kidnapped and sold off, but MaoMao is not related to Feng Ming that we know of, but she's related to the doctor who was expelled. So I don't know if they're saying like everyone connected to Feng Ming, the doctor was involved with Feng Ming, so they're both connected, and MaoMao is related to the doctor. So, or is there more skeletons in the closet that even MaoMao didn't know about? I really want to watch episode 12. I really want to watch episode 12, damn it. But I'm going to wait until I see the comments for the next episode. But, this is hard because I really, really want to watch the next episode. My only thing is either one of two things. Either MaoMao is somehow related to Feng Ming and didn't know about it. Maybe her mom that is in the brothel was related to her. I don't know. Or the doctor is how she's related to all of this, and they're just pointing it out because they found out she's related to the doctor. Maybe. But I can't see Jinshi punishing her for that. I don't know. I don't think Jinshi will try to punish her, but I don't know. So, But crazy talk, craziness, all the drama. I don't know. I want to watch episode 12 so bad, but I'm going to wait to the comments and then watch it soon. And hopefully by that point I will have read more of this book to get back to you, since we're practically the halfway point of season 1. I'm practically the halfway point of this book, so we'll just go with that. So anyway, I'm very curious to hear your comments down below. I hope you all have a wonderful week. Please stay safe, take care, and yeah, I'm back very soon with episode 12 of the Apothecary Diaries.